Hello, this is Terrence McNally. As Abbott and DeSantis cruelly ship asylum seekers thousands of miles in political stunts, here's my 2019 conversation with GREG GRANDIN about his book, The End of the Myth, From the Frontier to the Border Wall. Grandin reminds us that patrolling the border has always been overly aggressive and writes, quote, "The border wall is America's new myth, a monument to the final closing of the frontier. It is a symbol of a nation that used to believe that it had escaped history, but now finds itself trapped by history, and of a people who used to think they were captains of the future, but now are prisoners of the past." Hello, I'm Terrence McNally, and welcome to another newly recorded episode of Freeform, A World That Just Might Work. And I'm going to be speaking today with GREG GRANDIN about the provocative ideas in his latest book, The End of the Myth, From the Frontier to the Border Wall in the Mind of America. Let me set things up here first. After a 3-year hiatus since Trump's Electoral College victory, I've been doing a new interview every other week. Paul Hawken on climate change, Naomi Klein on No Is Not Enough, Arlie Hochschild on her book Strangers in Their Own Land, Stories That Divide Us, and Robert Wright on Why He's a Buddhist, etc., etc. The show airs as specials on KPFK 90.7 FM in LA, streams weekly on the Progressive Voices Network on TuneIn, and podcasts are available anytime, anywhere on Apple Podcasts or iTunes, Podomatic.com, and at my site, terrencemcnally.net, TERRENCEMCNALLY.net, and probably about 20 other podcast sites, too numerous to mention. And since I started doing these shows, I also, at the start of every show, offer a plug for participation. There are a number of organizations that arose or got active in resistance to the actions of the Trump administration, and now, over 2 years are now shifting sort of forward and so on. But here's some people, if you want to get more involved. Indivisible, one word, indivisible.us. That is probably the biggest organization, I would say, that is doing what I just described, and they have local chapters all over the country. Start of every week, you'll get an email telling you what's up, what phone calls to make, what actions to get involved in, and so on. MoveOn.org, one word, move on. Been around for, since 92 or 3, I think, and they were, for most of that period, primarily digital, but since the Trump election, they have been more closely coordinating with the grassroots. So that's a national organization, moveon.org. In the state of California, there's a similar organization, Courage Campaign, one word, .org. Again, digital, aligning with grassroots. And two specific ones, 5calls.org. That's the number 5 and the word calls, 5calls.org, which will tell you the most timely and relevant calls you might want to make regarding legislation in the offing. And Town Hall Project, one word, townhallproject.com, which tells you when your representatives are going to be in your local area for constituent meetings. And then if climate change is your thing, always check out 350, the number 350.org. Now to today's guest. Listeners know that we talk a lot on this show about the power of stories, narrative, and myths. And it's that perspective that made today's guest's new book grab my attention. In The End of the Myth, GREG GRANDIN, reminds us that ever since this nation's inception, the idea of an open and ever-expanding frontier has been central to American identity. It symbolizes a future of endless promise. It laid the foundation for the country's belief in itself as an exceptional nation, democratic, individualistic, forward-looking. Today, though, America has a new symbol, the border wall. As Grandin sees it, for centuries, America's constant expansion, fighting wars, opening markets, helped deflect domestic political and economic conflicts outward. It operated sort of as a safety valve. But this meant that the country's problems, from racism to inequality, were never directly confronted. And now, the 2008 financial crash, our unwinnable wars in the Middle East, have brought political passions back home. With them has come the rise of reactionary populism, racist nationalism, extreme anger, polarization, and Trump. GREG GRANDIN, professor of history at NYU, New York University, is the author of Fordlandia, a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, the National Book Award, and the National Book Critics Circles Award. His other books include Empire's Workshop, Kissinger's Shadow, The Empire of Necessity, and the latest, the one we're talking about today, The End of the Myth, From the Frontier to the Border Wall in the Mind of America. Welcome, Greg Grandin, to Free Forum, a world that just might work. And let me just tell listeners, we're recording this conversation Wednesday, May 15th.
Thanks, Terrence. Thanks for having me.
Okay, my pleasure. I like listeners to get a feel for the people that we're talking with, in addition to the work and the ideas that we're going to talk about. So can you tell us about your path to the work you do today? And you can go way back and maybe mention mentors, turning points, moments of decision, so they get a sense of who you are and why you're doing what you're doing.
Yeah, well, that's actually a nice entry point into the conversation. I was born and raised in Brooklyn, born in 1962, and I went to Brooklyn College a little bit late in life. I was the first person in my family to go to college, and then it was around the time of the end of the Cold War. There was a lot of debate among the faculty, among the progressive faculty, of whether Gorbachev was going to save socialism, and it was an interesting moment. But also, I became increasingly focused on Central America and U.S. policy in the 1980s, and I became involved politically, but then increasingly interested in scholarship and history, Guatemala and Nicaragua, and I did my dissertation on Guatemala at Yale University, and I've been teaching since I guess 1999. I was at Duke for a while, and then I came to NYU in 2001, and I was always interested in looking at Latin America, but then increasingly, but also through a kind of wider lens, thinking about U.S. role in the world. And many of my most recent books have focused on thinking about the United States in a larger context. And that's how I come to this topic in many ways, thinking about what's specific about American exceptionalism. And my vantage point from starting out looking at Latin America, being a historian of Latin America, has given me a certain kind of points of comparison. And one of the main points of comparison, and this leads to some of the more focused arguments of the book, is one of the structs of American exceptionalism. I mean, American exceptionalism means many things to different people.
Yeah.
But one of the things is an intense focus on individual rights, almost a fetish of individualism, and I contrast that with the social rights tradition in Latin America. With the widespread by individual rights, I mean all of those rights that are in the Bill of Rights, which tend to be understood as being conditioned predicated on restraint of the state. Things that Congress shall make no law. People have the right to have, to possess, to believe, to assemble. All of those things are predicated on a constraint of the state. But in Latin America, those rights exist also as valued as an ideal, if not always in practice. But they also deeply committed to the idea of social rights, in which a state acts to redistribute wealth in the form of education and healthcare, and that's the fundamental tension and point of comparison that I think I bring to the study of the United States.
Mm-hmm. So in other words, the U.S. was not looking as much to use the state to help people, as it were, and I think what the book says, it could get away with that because this endless expansion meant that your opportunity would come, right? That's
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. That fetish, that refusal to socialize liberalism. Forget social democracy. Forget socialism. I mean, other modern nations, republics, have they have liberalism socialized. They came to moderate the intense focus on the individual. That's not the case in the United States. I think this is one of the main central motives of the right that spills out beyond the right, but certainly a hardcore focus and obsession with the individual is unique to the United States. And that obsession and focus could be powerful. It could create wealth. It could create prosperity. It could create power, as it did in the United States. And it could be moderated to a degree, but only as long as the United States could keep expanding outward, across the landed frontier, then through markets, then through militarism. But it's predicated absolutely on the possibility of expansion, of the promise of limitless growth. And as soon as that promise ended, as you nicely summarized the argument of my book at the beginning, it became inward focused, almost all consuming and destructive. It didn't start with Donald Trump. I'd say that the first signs of it were the Tea Party and the profound racism that just exploded in the United States after Barack Obama's election. I think part of that was explained by the end of the frontier, the collapse of the ability of the United States to point outward, to deflect outward.
Mm-hmm. And my reading of it is not so much that every American thought, oh, good, as long as we can open a new market somewhere, I'm okay, or as long as we have 700 military bases, I'm okay. I think for most Americans, it was less tangible than it was mythical, that it was expansion, exceptionalism, opportunity, freedom, kind of.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that, whenever you're making an argument, this kind of large-scale political culture argument, it's always hard to, bring it down to the individual and say, well, how does this, I'm some working-class guy in Milwaukee. What do you mean, the myth of the frontier? I don't really care about the frontier. It's hard to kind of translate it into those terms. But yes, I think the way it worked is that that politics, the United States is unique in its ability that it used foreign policy to organize its domestic politics, to create whether it be a kind of messianic militarism that we saw with the first Iraq War, whether it be the promise of globalization, economic globalization, but social demands were met with the promise of limitlessness, and that's what we've lost. That's what is qualitatively different about the moment that we live in. And let me just say one more thing quickly, and we can go into it in detail later on. Is that how it played out? Is that there is no progressive movement in the United States, going back to the expansion of suffrage for white men, illiterate and unpropertied white men, that wasn't dependent on expansion. Jacksonian democracy was dependent on Indian removal. The end of slavery was dependent on the pacification of the West. The progressive movement was dependent on opening up foreign markets through the War of 1898. Women's suffrage, reformist labor, trade unionism was dependent on World War I. Even the New Deal was dependent on opening up foreign markets. The civil rights movement was predicated on fighting the Cold War. So on a very real level, everything that we think of as progress and liberal progress, what progressives like, has basically rode on the back of national power outward. And that's what's no longer possible.
Okay, that piece there, I don't think I'd quite fully taken in before. What I want to do, I'm going to ask you one question about as a scholar but an author, I'm always curious certainly where ideas come from, but what you hope to accomplish with a book like this.
Well, on a very basic level, I was trying to explain Trumpism. There's in all of the debates about whether Trump was or wasn't exceptional, whether he represented a violation of a steady, fitful but steady progress towards more tolerance and more openness kind of story that somebody like Barack Obama embraced and embodied, or whether he represented the fulfillment of a deep-seated settler colonial racism that was always present. I think both of those positions miss the central role of expansion plays in U.S. history and what it means that expansion is no longer possible. So Trumpism is what happens when the empire ends, when all of the violence that had been deflected outward comes back home to the heartland.
Right.
That's one of the things that I was trying to get at.
Yeah. No, I get that. Yeah. That that you like so many said, how did this happen and what does it mean?
Yeah.
And wrapped and it led you to this. What I'd love to set up for people is how far back this goes first, and then jump to, of course, Turner and his laying out of the frontier. But it's interesting when you said that that America has always, it's been outward has sort of defined inward in some, and international ended up defining domestic. In some ways, that's our origin, isn't it? In other words,
yeah. I mean, the settlement of North America was an expansionist project ideologically and materially. The expansion of European colonialism and what becomes mercantile capitalism, schisms within Christianity that driven forward by the Reformation, violent wars which emerged out of those processes, spilled over into and drove North American settlement and colonialism. And then going forward through the 1700s, by the time you get to the American Revolution, all of the people that were key intellectuals in the foundation of what became the United States came to believe that that a republic, that breaking with Great Britain, would only be successful if it was predicated, if it was based on expansion. That Benjamin Franklin came up with an early political economy that understood westward expansion as key to avoiding many of the problems of population growth and bad wages in that Europe was afflicted with. You had Thomas Jefferson, who understood expansion west not just to be a natural right, but the foundation of all natural rights, because it made freedom possible. Because when free men were threatened with some form of enthrallment, some kind of feudalism, they could just pick up stakes and move west, just like the Saxons did from Germany to the British Isles, and from the British Isles to North America, and Jefferson imagined that process continuing west. And then, perhaps most importantly, you had James Madison, who in Federalist Paper number 10 understood expansion to be central to the maintenance of Republican virtue. Now, why this is important is that prior to this, most Republican theorists, European Republican theorists, French Republican theorists, understood republicanism as only being possible in a small place, in a small country. A small nation would be able to contain all of the potential corruptions of virtue that emerged out of the pursuit of individual interests and property rights and wealth accumulation. Madison turned that on its head and said, no, all of those things that you're identifying as corruptions is actually the source of virtue. Private property, individual pursuit, the pursuit of happiness, the pursuit of ambition. And the way that you reconcile that with republicanism is, in his words, you extend the sphere. And by extending the sphere, you dilute extremism, you dilute faction, you dilute the tendency of what later would be called class conflict. And so even at the beginning, intellectually, the United States was founded on the idea of expansion, and philosophically. And then, of course, there was the actual process of expansion from the 7-Year War through the American Revolution, through Indian removal, through the Louisiana Purchase, through the Mexican-American War, all the way to the Pacific. The U.S. just moved forward in the 19th century across the continent like a whirligig.
Yes, but I mean, something else that was brand new to me in your book is that the causes of the revolution, the causes of the Declaration of Independence, were tied to this. I think most folks get some foggy notion of no taxation without representation, throw the tea overboard in Boston Harbor, etc. And you point out that the Royal Proclamation of 1763, something of which I'd never heard, sought to bound the frontier. And it said to the colonists, you're fine where you are, but you can't go into Indian lands. And that was one of the primary reasons of the revolution.
Yeah, Protestant Great Britain won the 7-Year War, which was a world war against Catholic France, and part of the settlement, because in North America it beat the French with significant indigenous participation, and the British Crown issued the proclamation, the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which sought to prohibit settlement west of the crest of the Alleghenies. They wanted to pen in white settlement east of the Alleghenies. Now, the British Crown wasn't disinterested. It didn't want to lose out on the fur trade to white settlers. But it was a very powerful statement, and it was an affront to both poorer settlers, squatters, who were already moving very quickly into indigenous land west of the Alleghenies, but also large-scale speculators. A lot of the, George Washington, Patrick Henry, many of the founding fathers grew rich speculating on land west of the Alleghenies.
Yeah, well,
and whether it be squire or squatter, they weren't going to be kept east of the Alleghenies. They were going west.
Yeah, exactly. Most of us think again of those founding fathers as either mercantile merchants in New England or farmers, but in fact this real estate speculation is deep in American bones.
Yeah, George Washington, shored up his family. He was a he was a disinherited son of a British colonialist that used speculation west of the Alleghenies to kind of reestablish his position. He did well in the 7-Year War.
Wow. Okay, so let's go up to Turner. So, people, you got that it's in our nature from the very start, and of course the fact that most people, most settlers, it was expansion in their own lives that led them there. They're in one country, they get on a boat, and now they've expanded their horizon. So it's, I think it's in our cultural DNA at that way as well. But let me go to Frederick Jackson Turner. 1893 really lays out this frontier notion, and as you point out, the word frontier wasn't even in the first dictionaries published in the U.S. And he says that the United States lies like a huge page in the history of society. Line by line, as we read this continental page from west to east, we find the record of social evolution. And he argued that the expansion of settlement across a frontier of free land created a uniquely American form of political equality, a vibrant, forward-looking individualism. What I'm curious about is how much did his essay, The Significance of the Frontier in American History, actually make people go, oh, that's what we're about, or was it in there and he just codified it?
Well, I think it was in there. I think it was the zeitgeist. I mean, look, what happens, just to back up from Turner a bit, as you just said, he's 1893. He gives this essay, The Significance of the Frontier in American History, at the Chicago World Fair. That becomes a classic seminal essay. It is both an idea and an argument, and it's turned into ideology. But what makes that possible really is if we go back about half a century to the Mexican-American War. Up until the Mexican-American War in 1846-48, the border and the frontier are kind of the same thing in the United States. They're both moving west, Indian removal, the Mississippi River, up to the Red River and the Sabine River. What happens with the Mexican-American War is that they disassociate. The United States takes a third of Mexico with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and brings itself to the Pacific. it has the southern border. That's the establishment of what is now more or less the border with Mexico. But that war allows the idea of the frontier to kind of float free as an abstraction. The frontier, as you mentioned, the word frontier basically just meant border up until that point, or military front. And its cognates in other languages, frontera in Spanish, pretty much mean that today. But in the United States, after it separates from the actual border itself, it becomes more of a concept that signals existential creation, a kind of more civilizational zone, the line separating civilization from savagery. And that's what makes Turner possible. And Turner is just, he does codify what's out there in the zeitgeist in some ways. Woodrow Wilson, who was a colleague of Turner at Hopkins, also wrote an essay in 1893 on the frontier. That Theodore Roosevelt wrote books on the frontier. So it was out there, but Turner's genius was twofold. It was based on two parts. One is, prior to Turner, other Boston Brahmin historians and scholars tended to think that everything good about the United States was exported from Europe. You know, that basically it came over from Great Britain. Turner said no. Everything good about the United States was created on the frontier. It's mild individualism. It's innovation. It's curiosity. It's vitality. The second thing he did, that Turner does that is absolutely indispensable, is that he deracinates. He takes all of the bloody and violent interpretations of Western expansion. If you read Theodore Roosevelt celebrates violent war against Native Americans as the foundation of Western civilization. He celebrates it. He thinks it's absolutely indispensable. There's none of that in Turner. He begins to universalize it. He talks about war, but it's really commerce and transportation and communication and law and public policy that are the great that makes the frontier possible. It's the innovativeness and the stick-with-itness of the pioneers, but he doesn't celebrate them as Saxon warriors as Roosevelt does. And that's absolutely key, because the United States is about to leap out into the world. A couple of years later, the U.S. launches a war against Spain, takes the Philippines, takes Puerto Rico, turns Cuba into a neo-colonial possession, and the United States can't administer the world as if it was Oklahoma writ large, as if it was Louisiana Purchase writ large.
Right.
You know, the racism that was involved in Anglo-Saxon dominance of the Mexican secession or Louisiana Purchase or Indian removal can't justify what the United States is becoming. So Turner is absolutely indispensable to whitewashing, if you want to agree, whatever word you want to call it, Anglo-Saxon supremacy and universalizing it. So even if you acknowledge that Western expansion was predicated on ethnic cleansing and murder and rape and dispossession, you could credibly argue that the United States, as it moved forward in the world, would leave that behind, that the particularism of Anglo-Saxon expansion would become liberal universalism. And that's absolutely key to what becomes American exceptionalism. America sets of itself as a universal nation.
Right, and then in World War I, World War II, and especially post-World War II, the United States gets to sort of say, when it's setting up Bretton Woods and it's helping set up the United Nations, all those things which Trump doesn't like, it's actually, that's really the taking this exceptionalism and taking it outward as far as it can go and resetting up the world system in its image.
Yeah, and to put it as crudely as possible, you see two through lines you see the ongoing continuation of Anglo-Saxon racism and white supremacy, and it's manifested itself in different ways. In 1924, immigration law, for instance, which we could talk about. But there's also this through line of a kind of denial of that racism, a kind of insistence that the United States represents some kind of universal liberal ideal, and that's manifested in a new kind of global hegemony, to put it simply, which particularly takes shape after World War II. Henry Luce's American Century, this idea that the world isn't a winner-take-all world, that if the United States could superattend a new kind of global political economy in which if nations play by the rules, all nations will rise, everybody could sit at the table, a kind of either naive or disingenuous, however you want to call it, because the system that was put into place was far from universal and equal. but at least it was premised on a formal universalism, a formal equality. So you see these two through lines, and the argument is that Trump represents the first, a return of a kind of Anglo-Saxon supremacy and white racism and nativism that was always present, but as the United States was moving out in the world, could be denied, could be subordinated, could be contained.
This is Terrence McNally. You're listening to my 2019 conversation with Greg Grandin about his book, The End of the Myth, From the Frontier to the Border Wall in the Mind of America. And you can learn more at greggrandin.com. This is Freeform, a world that just might work. I'm Terrence McNally, speaking with Greg Grandin about the provocative ideas in his latest book, The End of the Myth, From the Frontier to the Border Wall in the Mind of America. How we went from a country that the frontier was our big myth to suddenly it's I'll build a beautiful wall. And one of the things is that you point out how I'm going to quote the way that Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Clinton, and George W. Bush all used frontier. We were just talking about how after World War II it gets this kind of new meaning. So Reagan pursued his anti-communist wars in Central America by declaring it our southern frontier. George H.W. Bush saw the crumbling of the Berlin Wall and imagined new markets for American products, proclaiming that in the frontiers ahead there are no borders. Clinton declared as he signed NAFTA, this new global economy is our new frontier. George W. Bush launched a global war on terror with the promise to extend the frontiers of freedom. And I do that just as you did to show that this notion is so embedded. And in each one of those, by the way, what you want to see is that they are talking about expansion, and they are justifying it as this American mission to extend the frontier and civilize the frontier, right?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, look, Trump might or might not use the word frontier. He just doesn't negate anything that we've just said.
Right.
But it is true that these other presidents, and what's important about all of this is Reagan's restoration of the idea of the frontier. There was a moment which, we might or might not get to, where the New Deal and 1930s, 40s began to socialize the frontier in some extent, and when the nation comes closest to some ideal of social democracy or social liberalism, and that comes to an end in the 1970s. The loss in Vietnam, the global economic crisis of Keynesianism, and Reagan's centrality and Reagan's ascension and supplanting of the New Deal coalition with the New Right was based on this idea of a restored frontier that every president subsequently, George H.W. Bush, Clinton, George W. Bush, all rode. They each had their own particular vector of interest, George W. Bush with militarism, Bill Clinton with economic globalism, but they all pushed it to the limit.
Yeah. So one thing that I don't think we have much time to talk about, but I just want you to mention, to do a little bit on, is how the defense of the southern border by militias and then by the Border Patrol, the least regulated law enforcement piece of the federal government, was a ready place for former Confederates to be able to keep fighting, to fight people of color and be brutal to people of color, while sort of feeling like now we're part of the Union.
Yeah. Well, the border becomes, as it becomes detached from the frontier, and that metaphor of the frontier marginalizing supremacy and marginalizing extremism, it wasn't really just a metaphor. It literally was marginalized along the border. The violence and of the border, which grows over time, and the founding of the Border Patrol in 1924, the increasing attention of nativists on Mexico and Mexicans, that becomes this kind of site of brutality and violence. That what we're seeing now is in different manifestations: the Texas Rangers, the Border Patrol, National Guard, local police force, or local vigilantes. And oftentimes there was no distinction between any of those categories. Festered over the years, and again, it could be contained and marginalized and kept on the border until it couldn't, until it becomes nationalized. And what we're seeing now is the nationalization of border brutalism, right? The way in which the violence that had been contained along that 2,000-mile long line has now become all-consuming and devouring of national politics and attention.
Right.
And there's so much to talk about the ways in which the different manifestations of violence, but certainly the Border Patrol has been one of the most unaccountable federal agencies in the United States. And in a separate article that I did for The Intercept, I talk about the way in which every other federal law enforcement agency in the 1970s had some kind of reckoning. The CIA, the FBI, even the IRS, the Church Committee, the Pike Committee, some kind of restructuring and accountability. Not the Border Patrol. The Border Patrol, was in this liminal zone of the foreign and domestic, and it remained this site of unaccountable. So all of the violence and all of the brutality and all the stories that were child separation as a tactic, torture. These are the corruption, long-standing practices within the Border Patrol, and now it's become nationalized.
Right. So now let me switch to you mentioned it before that under FDR was perhaps a moment there where. I tend to have an understanding of why I think that moment happened, but a moment where actually we would instead of using expansion as a safety valve or the myth as a safety valve, we would actually create some socially democratic programs to actually solve some of the problems that that safety valve was letting us avoid. And my sense is that in the face of the Depression, and in the face of isolationist feelings to not want to get involved in what was going on in Europe, that myth just didn't stand up, right? And so and when that myth isn't standing up, there's two ways to go. One is to actually create programs that will solve the problems, and the other is to make it about the border. Under FDR, we actually tried to solve some of those problems. Under Trump, now with the crash of 2008, and the unwinnable wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere, that same realization that this expansion thing isn't really working leads instead to the fencing off and the fetishization of the border.
Yeah, and what's interesting, there's some different moments throughout U.S. history in which revanchism and the extremism and violence of foreign war flows back into the United States, but what's interesting about the current moment is that the rise of the nativist movement took place simultaneously with the U.S.'s war on terror, and the moment of the emergence of the new militia movement, the Minutemen Project in 2005, is almost pegged exactly to the moment that the Abu Ghraib scandal exposed the bankruptcy, the moral bankruptcy, the tactical bankruptcy of the neocons' war in Iraq, and that kind of nativism that was represented by the Minutemen Project gained increasing influence and basically took over the Republican Party, and that's where we are today.
And one bit of thought, again, I want you to touch on and bring out briefly, is the way that Martin Luther King Jr., especially in the years just preceding his death, began to challenge the myth of the frontier and of American exceptionalism.
Yeah, Martin Luther King Jr. was what I like to call a social frontier theorist. So where he the thing about the frontier theory is that it contains within itself the terms of its own critique. So you could understand, you could take the argument that it's the frontier that creates a kind of individualism, but instead of celebrating individualism, you understand the pathological dimensions of a certain kind of individualism, or the racist dimensions of a certain kind of individualism that is attached and only to white settlers. So Martin Luther King started to use the phrase frontier around the time that JFK began to use the word frontier to talk about the new frontier and all of that stuff. But King turned the theory on its head. He talked about the way in which basically the Homestead Act and the massive distribution of Western land, which of course was only possible because of dispossession from indigenous communities and peoples, undergird what he called the white peasantry. and so he used it to talk about the hypocrisy of a nation that has rugged individualism for the poor, but massive subsidies for the rich in the forms of corporate subsidies and the tax code. King also talked about the ways in which the myth of the frontier bred a kind of what we would call toxic masculinity today. Pathological, racist, prone to violence, and this, I think, is one of the things that often get lost when we discuss King's nonviolence and philosophy of nonviolence. It wasn't so much an ethical position, which of course it was, or some absolutist Kantian position. King understood it in tactical terms. He understood that the kind of that the United States was such a violent country, and with its roots in this kind of mythic history of the frontier and the violence of the West, that nonviolence was actually a higher form of self-control, right? Because if it's a foundation of white identity, that only white people have self-control and therefore are worthy of sovereignty, the ability to respond without violence, to control and not respond and react to provocation was evidence of a greater form of self-control, and what King had hoped would be the foundation of what he called the beloved community, as a counter, as an exact counter to the violence of the frontier, to the mythology of the frontier, to what Richard Slotkin called this cult of violence, that regenerates itself constantly through racism and through war against people of color.
Okay, so as you say, King sought to orient the consciousness of the country away from the violent frontier towards a social frontier that could combat, quote, a wilderness of segregation, right? That there would always be challenges that needed to be overcome, and that perhaps that American urge, that American impulse of overcoming challenges could be transferred from expansionist wars and the violence that entails to defeating things like segregation, tapping that same American impulse but without the violence.
Yeah, and of course his prophecy was fulfilled with Vietnam. I mean, he started talking about the frontier
That's right.
well before Vietnam
That's right.
came on the horizon, and the United States launched itself into that new frontier of catastrophe with, it was quite impressive with the velocity in which the U.S. destroyed itself in Southeast Asia, and felt like it couldn't escape the where the frontier becomes this myth of eternal return. And there's it's a historian in the 1970s said it seemed like cowboys and Indians were the only game that the United States knew how to play.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I want to build on what I think King was looking toward, and I think actually when Kennedy talks about space as a frontier, and I don't think at that point he was necessarily talking about the space force that Trump is talking about, but as just the blossoming of science and ingenuity, and then talks about a new frontier, which was, I think, again, it wasn't about Vietnam or expansion. It was something more benign than that. Now, it seems to me that one of the things that Trump has right is that we do live in a world of limits. And as you point out, the three things which sort of made this limitless vision, have trouble was, as I said before, the crash of 2008, the wars in the Middle East, and climate change. All of these say, wait a minute, things are not limitless. Reagan, I know, had said some. I forget the quote. Oh yeah, Reagan said nothing is impossible. There are no limits to growth, which is particularly a strong statement when countered to Carter's the speeches towards the end of his presidency that got him in trouble, in which he said, "Wait a minute, this endless." Growth is not giving us meaning. It's not satisfying our spiritual needs. And America had none of that and went right for Reagan, and we've kind of been on that march ever since. Trump recognizes the limits, which are recognized by environmentalists, which are recognized by anyone who cares about climate change. But what he does with that recognition is so negative. My question is, and I'm going to set it up. I recently interviewed Arlie Hochschild, who wrote "Strangers in Their Own Land." And for those who don't know, I assume you're familiar with this, but she spent 5 years. She's a sociologist from Berkeley. She spent 5 years researching and spending a lot of time in southern Louisiana, one of the most polluted areas, whether with chemicals or petrochemicals, the erosion of the land. It's an area that has been completely ruptured and spoiled by corporations, and yet what she found was that the folks down there do not hold it against the corporations, they hold it against the government, and her question was why. She comes up with a story that they're telling themselves, etc. But when I interviewed her, I said, soon after the 2016 election, I saw this quote, and it really struck me. And it's a quote from Antoine Saint-Exupéry, in which he says, "If you want to build a ship, don't drum up the men to gather wood, divide the work, and give orders. Instead, teach them to yearn for the vast and endless sea." Right? And I like that quote. I went, oh, yeah, how do we do that in 2017, 2018, 2019? How do we create a vision of the future that is as promising as the vision of the past that Trump's people and others want to return to? How do we take that emotion and turn it into a yearning for something better rather than a yearning for protection from the future? And so this is when I first saw your book, I went, it was kind of threw my ideas, in turmoil, because I'm thinking, and specifically when I asked Hochschild, what story do you think that might be? What narrative do you think that might be? She said, well, I think it's about the frontier. It's about the frontier of taking on the challenge of climate change, of taking on the challenge of automation and what it's going to do to work. It's taking on those challenges And and if we tap that great American
Yeah.
spirit, this should be, So, what do you say to all that?
Well, there's a lot to say. One, I would say the frontier is a metaphor, and it could be deployed in widely different ways, and we shouldn't read too much in just the use of the word frontier. I mean, the New Dealers, the people who socialized American democracy, more than during any other period, they use the word frontier repeatedly. Henry Wallace said to tame the social frontier, to conquer the social wilderness. What they meant by that, they meant that there were new realms they meant actually recognizing interdependency and obligation and mutual responsibility and mutual dependence. They turned the frontier thesis on its head to talk about. FDR was a student of Frederick Jackson Turner at Harvard. So, although apparently he went sailing in the semester that he took a class, but he absorbed enough of it that he would repeat the frontier thesis. He would give a 5-minute précis of the frontier thesis, and then he would say with a wave of his hand, but those days are gone. And today we have a social responsibility. And they talked about social They affixed the preface adjective social to all of these Turner categories: the social wilderness, the social frontier, social individualism, social rights. And so there's ways in which that, the word frontier obviously could be used for that. But to get back to Trump, so yes, the point of the book, there's two ways to respond to the idea that there are limits, that we live in a world in which we could understand those limits in racialized terms, or we could understand those limits in humane terms, that we are social beings, that the smallest common denominator, human denominator, isn't one but two. There is no such thing as a human being unless there is another human being. That we are mutually interdependent, and that we should have policies that reflect that. So Trumpism, there's a temptation to think of Trumpism as a more disenchanted but honest way of thinking about the world. Sometimes it's called race realism, with the emphasis on realism, actually, that it's a recognition that there are limits, that things that not everybody can sit at the table, not all boats will rise up, that the old internationalist order has ended, and we have to live in a world of dominance and domination, and that's what the wall symbolizes. But Trumpism is its own form of enchantment, its own illusion, because it says that basically if we put up that wall, we could continue on as we're going. We could burn as much coal as we want. We could burn as much energy as we want. And it's a restoration of the idea of freedom as freedom from restraint, which is as idealist and illusionary as anything that came before it. And it's its own form of enchantment. And it turns cruelty into this cultural kind of assertion. That idea of freedom as freedom from restraint becomes manifest in these expressions of extreme cruelty. Who's going to tell us that we can't burn coal? Who's going to tell us that we can't put kids in concentration camps? Who's going to tell us that we can't separate? We are our own. We are a nation state, and we could do what we want. So it's its own form of illusion, that if we put up the wall, we could continue on as before. And obviously, that's not true.
Right. And by the way, one thing I just want to mention, but this is the through line I want to use to the end of the hour. But I do want to mention that you point out that the wall itself is a myth, that it's not about building a 2,000-mile wall. It's about talking about those who don't want us to build a wall. Its use is as a political myth to keep the base excited, rather than actually a construction project.
And it embodies this kind of nativism. It captures it. It symbolizes it. But you know what else it does? It also is politically useful, because it points out the hypocrisy of the old order. Because the old order, the globalizers, as Trump would say, they freed capital, they freed commodities, but NAFTA, which is the supreme crown jewel in the previous global order's crown, was founded on the idea of immobilizing labor. If you actually look at Bill Clinton signs NAFTA into law at the exact same moment he begins to militarize the border. So to talk about a wall doesn't just capture the new, some kind of new nativism that Trump represents. It allows Trump to point out the hypocrisy of the people that came before, and frankly, rightly so.
So my sort of question, as I said, when I picked up your book, when I started wrestling with these ideas, is I still want to see what is a new American story that can take those people who are afraid, and rightfully so, given the crash, the endless wars, and climate change, to sort of bring them back into the social frontier, to the sort of as you said, it can be humane, it can be racist and brutal. I want to rehabilitate that as a myth that taps into something deep in America, but that can move us forward rather than backward.
Yeah, and to bring it back where the conversation started, I think that is social democracy, and to just say social democracy is one thing, but to understand in the context of the United States how radical the word social is, and how heretical it is in terms of a political culture founded on individualism. Look, when Rand Paul says that if you believe in the right to health care, it's like saying you believe in the right to slavery. That sounds like an insane thing.
Yes, it does.
But it's logical within the culture of the United States, because health care entails the state actively acting to create virtue rather than restraining itself to allow virtue to sprout from individuals' pursuit of self-interest and property. Mm-hmm. So there's a profound logic to what seems to the surface insanity of the racist right that is founded on an untenable individualism, a cult of individualism that's impossible to disassociate from white supremacy and racism. That said, not all individualism is race. Of course, individual rights and political freedom are important. But as other countries learned in different ways, it has to be balanced with some form of social democracy and social rights. And to say that is a profoundly, in the context of the United States, is a new myth, and it's a workable myth. It could be a new humane myth to counter. Myths aren't bad things. They organize the way we think about the world, and they can be useful and powerful and generative at times, but they can also exhaust themselves and be destructive and devouring. And the United States' myth of limitlessness has become that.
Okay, we're going to wrap it up here. I'm going to read the last lines of the book, which I see now are right where we ended the conversation. Coming generations will face a stark choice, a choice long deferred by the emotive power of frontier universalism, but set forth in vivid relief by recent events, the choice between barbarism and socialism, or at least social democracy. Those are the last lines of the book. The book is The End of the Myth, From the Frontier to the Border Wall in the Mind of America, and the website is greggrandin.com, GREG GRANDIN.com. For this conversation and many other interviews, articles, and to join me in pursuit of a world that just might work, go to terrencemcnally.net or aworldthatjustmightwork.com. They're the same website. You can find their podcasts that go back many years. If you want to get a weekly email announcement telling you who's going to be on, what we're going to talk about, plus 8 or 10 articles that I choose to flesh out the conversation, sign up at my site or email me at temcnally@mac.com. You can also subscribe and listen to the Freeform podcast on iTunes or Apple Podcasts. You can find, as I said, years of podcasts at my site. Jeremy Scahill, Michael Lewis, Naomi Klein, Robert Reich, Van Jones, Connie Rice, Greg Boyle. You can follow me on Twitter at McNally Terrence. Thanks to Mark Maxwell in production, George Vasilopoulos, the Progressive Voices, and most of all, you, my listeners. Please share this podcast widely. Thank you, Greg Grandin. Keep up the good work.
Thanks so much, Terrence. Thanks for having me. It was a great conversation.